Hi, everyone. My name is Melanie Kress, and I am the Associate Curator for Highline Art, the public art program presented by the Highline here in New York City. I want to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the fifth conversation in our speaker series, The Normalizing Gaze, Surveillance from Drones to Phones, this program being titled Building Surveillance, 3 Chapters in U.S. History. This series is organized in conjunction with artist Sam Durant's Highline Plinth Commission Untitled Drone, which opened this past spring and will be on view on the Highline at 30th Street through August 2022. Untitled Drone is a large-scale fiberglass sculpture in the shape of an abstracted drone sitting atop a 25-foot-tall steel pole. This work continues Highline Art's mission of presenting new, powerful, thought-provoking artworks that generate and amplify some of today's most important conversations. Inspired by this artwork, the speaker series brings together artists, activists, scholars, filmmakers, and journalists, and more to demystify the twinned histories of surveillance and drone warfare and to illuminate routine examples of surveillance in our daily lives. The Normalizing Gaze is presented by the Highline and the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, a nonprofit advocacy organization and legal services provider that litigates and advocates for privacy, working to abolish local government systems of surveillance. As we begin, I have a few announcements regarding the logistics of the event, which will also be included in the chat. Throughout the presentation and discussion, we invite you to please ask questions. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and we'll select questions for our moderator. If you would like to use closed captioning, please go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click the CC option. Here you will be able to find the captions. And if you have any technical questions along the way, you can drop them in the Q&A. And lastly, in the coming days after the series, a recording of this and all of our events will be posted on the Highline's website for future viewing. Although we are in virtual space together, before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I come to you today from Manhattan, New York, on the ancestral land of the Munsee Lenape. If you are interested in finding out the name of the indigenous people whose land you may live on, please visit the link in the chat. And I would now like to introduce our event moderator, Lilly Irani. Lilly is an associate professor of communication and science studies at the University of California, San Diego, and serves as faculty in the Design Lab, Institute for Practical Ethics, the program in Critical Gender Studies, and sits on the Academic Advisory Board of AI at NYU. Lilly, thank you so much for being here and moderating our conversation with these three amazing speakers. And I will pass it to you to introduce the event and our speakers.
Hi, thank you so much, Melanie, for the opportunity to be in conversation with these amazing panelists. I'm thrilled to be moderating this conversation because surveillance is a matter of life and death for some who are caught in surveillance's crosshairs, and also it's a matter of how we organize, how we live together. I also want to acknowledge that I speak here from unceded Kumeyaay land, and that in the border region of San Diego and Tijuana, where I live, the border actually bisects land where people need to cross the border all the time to work, to visit their families, and the border splits communities that have long pre-existed the border. And so surveillance technologies are not at all an abstraction, are often just innovated and experimented on us here, which I'll talk a little bit about. So I'm actually a scholar of technology and kind of the anthropology of innovation, but I'm also an organizer who works at community coalitions here in San Diego to transform our relationships to technology, both as workers and as those who are surveilled. I didn't actually come to surveillance as a scholarly topic. It came to me as a topic that was crucially urgent because of the neighborhoods that I lived in and the people that I cared about. Over the last 2 years here in San Diego, I've been part of a community coalition fighting to regulate surveillance technologies. It was sparked by a smart cities effort that put 3,000 street lights with video, audio, and artificial intelligence units, with object recognition capabilities all over our city. But these street lights sparked so many communities who were organized to notice that there's so many other technologies, license plate readers, location data from our phones, for example, that already suffuse the environments in which our movements are tracked and regulated. In San Diego, a military contractor, General Dynamics, even tried to market its Predator drone rebranded as a Sky Guardian for monitoring traffic in our region. And cities like in Baltimore and Minnesota, Black Lives Matter protesters and citizens have been surveilled by drones with high fidelity photography capabilities. Technologies change, but the histories that we're going to learn about today help us understand the kinds of futures that we need to be coming together in communities to defend against. The techniques, practices, and infrastructures that are deployed against one set of people are easy for organizations and institutions to redeploy against others. The panelists that we have today have each helped movements across the country and also in San Diego in understanding and grasping the significance of the surveillance that we face. Simone Browne is an associate professor at UT Austin. She's also research director of the Critical Surveillance Inquiry with Good Systems group. CSI works with scholars, organizations, and communities to curate conversations, exhibitions, and research that examine the social and ethical implications of surveillance, both AI-enabled and not. And on a personal note, here from San Diego, some of us in the coalition read Simone Browne's Dark Matters to understand and explain how surveillance brings only some people into light and visibility so they can be dominated or exploited by others. Assia Boundaoui is an Algerian-American filmmaker and investigative journalist. Her award-winning directorial debut, The Feeling of Being Watched, is a documentary investigating a decade of FBI surveillance in her Muslim American community. And no lie, as part of Tech Workers Coalition here in San Diego, we screened Assia's film to do political education as we were gathering our coalition and trying to educate people about how new tech is actually built on really old surveillance practices. And finally, Omar Farah is a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights and is the lead lawyer in a current case, Color of Change versus Department of Homeland Security and Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI. And the case seeks records that reveal the government's expansive surveillance of the movement for Black lives. Omar focuses on an array of CCR's litigation and advocacy in response to abusive policing and counterterrorism practices. And he was really generous with his time, and he came and spoke in a political education session in San Diego to educate us on contemporary histories of the criminalization of Muslim Americans, as well as the criminalization of dissent. So these are not just scholars, filmmakers, and advocates that have come together on this panel, but these are people who in various ways have done work that really shapes the work people do on the ground. I hope the conversation today helps us walk out as an audience, inspired to act with others, forming the solidarities we will need to see, control, and even abolish the punitive formations that promise order but produce harm. And with that, I will pass the mic to Simone.
Thank you, Lilly, for this introduction. I'm so happy to be on this panel with you all today, and thank you to the High Line and to the audience here. So I've been to the High Line more than a few times, once to see artist Sable Leaf Smith's sculpture, Cream, a sculpture that takes to task prisons and property, segregation, and incarceration. About the High Line, I learned that in 1847, the city authorized the construction of the street-level railroad tracks that would later be demolished to make for what is now the High Line. In the century before the decision to render the line on high, the runaway notices found in some of the various editions of the New York Gazette and the Weekly Postboy told of a Negro man named Sippy who speaks good and proper English, but with a hoarse voice. And one on a likely Negro man named Isaac, who was said to be about 30 years of age, well set, and could play the fiddle. There was an announcement seeking the apprehension of a Negro man named Sam, who was pretty tall, noting that he had lately had the smallpox and is pitted with it pretty much. $10 reward for a Negro wench named Savannah, with a scar on her upper part of her nose, and an ad for a Negro woman named Pamela. It was said that she was squire built, very lusty, and said that she was deceitful and given to lying. There was one published in 1757 about a man named Toby who pretends to tell fortunes, and he was branded when in Jamaica as a boy with the letters BC, which are plain to be seen. These notices chart lines of flight and Black escape around the city. Runaway advertisements instruct readers to be on the lookout for Black people who refused enslavement and escaped. And they also reveal a lot about the Black flight to freedom, as these notices of escape would not only name those who left enslavement and made their own way, but also provide a physical description and list of monetary rewards, if any, if that awaited those who aided in their capture and return. These ads would list their talents, occupations, skills, vices, languages spoken, and whether or not they can read or write or do maths, listed strategies they might have used to escape, and what they were wearing when they took off, and what they took with them and made their way. That could be clothing, musical instruments, and other items that could be sold, traded, bartered, or used to support the appearance of being free. Through the detailing of these physical descriptions, runaway slave advertisements is one early surveillance technology that made use of biometric identification, like pock marks, or quote, his hair was frizzled, being half Indian, unquote, or the scar left behind from a branding iron. The branding of enslaved people could be understood here as a technology of tracking Blackness that sought to make certain people's bodies legible as property and unfree. Reading the weekly news was a mode of conscripting the white public into the terror of anti-Black policing, where the potential of being under watch by a cumulative white gaze functioned as an almost totalizing surveillance of Black and Indigenous life in the city, particularly when you pair that reading of the weeklies as fundamental to policing with the omnibus type laws and codes that govern New York City in the 18th and early 19th century. Like the Common Council of the city, reauthorizing laws in 1784 against assembly of Black folks against the carrying of weapons or riding on horseback throughout the city by trotting too fast or in some other disorderly fashion. Rules against gaming and gambling and making too loud of a noise outdoors on Sundays, along with other regulations that if, after sunset, one was caught outside unsupervised by a white person, they would need to have with them, carrying with them at all times, a lit candle in a lantern. Of course, unsupervised leisure, labor, laughter, and using one's outdoor voice, travel and assembly, and other forms of social networking past sunset by free and enslaved Black and Indigenous New Yorkers continued regardless of the enforcement of rules meant to curtail such things. One could say that the laws around the supervision of Black city life form part of the historically present legal framework for stop and frisk policing practices, where the categories of suspicion could be furtive movements, fits a relative description, or changes direction at the sight of a police officer, or inappropriate attire for the season. Those were all taken from what was the NYPD stop and frisk data set. Or 18th century laws that lantern laws as precursors to New York City Police Department's omnipresent strategy, where flashing lights from police cruisers or floodlights are projected into certain high-rise and other city housing, exposing the occupants to a constant and high-intensity artificial light. All this is to say that laws, lanterns, runaway notices, biometric identification by way of branding all played a key role in the historical formation of surveillance. But what this archive also reveals are modes of refusal and of rebellion, moves that were ingenious and inventive and that demonstrate an experiential insight of methods of surveillance in order to trouble, to resist, and to undo them. Like pretending to be free, using an alias, or hiding in plain sight. Or in 1851, a handbill distributed by abolitionists from Massachusetts that advised colored people of Boston to keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers, who would act as slave catchers under the fugitive slave laws that federalized anti-Black surveillance. There are other chapters in New York's history and present where what Anna Feigenbaum and Anya Kannengeiser have termed atmospheric policing have had a cruel and aerial hold on life. Atmospheric policing is, to quote Karen Kaplan, citing Feigenbaum and Kannengeiser here, quote, those technologies and techniques for the controlling of populations that are fundamentally predicated on their relationship with air and that colonize space in ways that other weapons do not, end quote. You can think of the May 13th, 1985 MOVE bombing by the Pennsylvania State Police helicopter, or in 1921 when nitroglycerin and burning turpentine balls rained down from low-flying planes attacking the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, also known as Black Wall Street. Or the National Guard using low-flying helicopters as a violent means of intimidation during Black Lives Matter protests and uprising against the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020. I'll quote from poet M. Norbesi Philip from a journal, Synthesis. M. Norbesi Philip tells us, quote, "We live in forensic landscapes. We also inhabit the scene of the crime," end quote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone. I'd like to welcome Assia to speak.
Thank you, Lilly, and thank you, Simone, for that. I wanted to start by showing a little clip or a trailer, actually, of The Feeling of Being Watched, a personal and investigative documentary film that I made and that premiered in 2018. And I also wanted to just mention that the making of this film took 5 years. It started in 2013 and it ended in 2018. And just, the discourse around surveillance in those 5 years changed so dramatically. Like I remember beginning the film pre-Edward Snowden and having to convince folks that some of these things that were happening in my immigrant Muslim neighborhood were real, and how much the conversation shifted. And also thinking about Dr. Simone Browne's book coming out and Dark Matters being such an important reading for me in the making of the film. And also the AP investigation into the NYPD spying in New York, which Omar and the Center for Constitutional Rights worked on. Anyway, just to mention that there's a thread in this work that was very much informed by these brilliant folks on the panel. So I will go ahead and share my screen.
And he gave his name as Mr. Rose. He said, I'm an FBI agent.
I start seeing, cars with no plate numbers.
We don't think that anything wrong.
That damn car is always just parked right there.
It's like how you see in the movies, like those pizza vans that are just sitting staked out in front of your house. When you pass the van by, like they pull up a book or a magazine, like we can see you.
There it is. Bridgeview mosque leaders have been under surveillance for years.
Since August of 1999, I've been working to legally expose the very real and foreseeable Middle Eastern terrorist threats to American citizens at home and abroad. The successful investigation, which was codenamed Vulgar Betrayal, V-U-L-G-A-R, Betrayal,
I want to find out everywhere that our name is on a list.
I'm suing the FBI for information about surveillance, and I need as many people as possible to sign privacy waivers, so if the FBI has a file on them, they will release it.
Please, امشي. خلاص كفاية.
So The Feeling of Being Watched, you just saw a clip of the trailer, but a big part of the film was looking into an FBI investigation codenamed Operation Vulgar Betrayal, which began in the early 90s and went on for a little under a decade. Basically swept up my entire neighborhood, which was predominantly immigrant Arab and Muslim community in the southwest suburbs of Bridgeview. And a big part of my investigation into this FBI operation involved a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit and suing the FBI for the surveillance records that were collected and all the records that were collected in the course of this investigation. And this has been a long-running investigation, or long-running litigation to get transparency and to have the FBI be transparent about this investigation that targeted my neighborhood. And there's something to be said about the documents. Actually, there's something that reminds me of something Simone wrote in her book about the gaze of surveillance getting further and further from the subjects that are being surveilled. And in the 90s, there was a lot of physical surveillance that was happening and that we remembered even as little children growing up in the neighborhood, of cars being parked on the side of the street. And this is an example of, so remembering that there would be like cars parked on the street, and our parents would specifically warn us not to talk to the strangers in the cars, not because they thought they were kidnappers, but because they were worried they were federal agents. And it was interesting, decades later to come across documents like this one, when I won these records from the FBI in the lawsuit, which is a surveillance log of physical activity, and, literally shows FBI agents hand initialing on the left, signing in and out of, being parked out or physically present outside somebody's home or outside, the elementary school or outside the mosque. So, these documents also strike me that, it's not just the act of surveillance itself, of being, of this physical surveillance, of being present outside people's homes, of, interviewing and people in their workplaces, and knocking on people's doors and asking them questions. It was also the act of collecting these, in this case, 33,000 pages of records. The act of collecting them was also violent. The act of, keeping them in perpetuity and sharing them with other agencies was also an act of violence. But something interesting, that comes out of these documents also is that they tell us more about the FBI field office in Chicago and about this specific government agency that was investigating us. They tell us a lot about them. And there's a whole subaltern reading of these documents that I became very interested in, and that also point to a long history of the use of these tactics, specifically in Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities of color. And part of the film, I talk about this long history, and here are some images, basically that these tactics that were used over and over again happened over about 100-year period, and can be evidenced in, the FBI's investigation of the Puerto Rican independence movement, of the American Indian movement, of COINTELPRO, which was the investigation into the civil rights and Black liberation movement in the 60s and 70s, and into the Nation of Islam. So there's a great book that I have an image of here at the top, Agents of Repression, that details the FBI's long history, conducting surveillance operations and investigations into communities of color, but specifically communities of color that are organizing. And these are some images from the book on the bottom left of a tank rolling into Wounded Knee during the armed FBI operation against the American Indian movement. And then also here on the bottom right, one of the tactics that comes out in the documents about my neighborhood, and that comes out in a lot of these documents that were obtained through Freedom of Information Act and COINTELPRO, was the FBI's use of psych operations, of propaganda. This is an image that the LA field office of the FBI here on the very bottom right was putting out some of the propaganda that was created specifically to, discredit the Black Panther Party. And another thing, besides the tactics, these are on the left-hand side, an image from the 30s of, this idea of like, conscription, of conscripting the general masses to, to participate. If you see something, say something. This was also a tactic that you can find really early on that the FBI was using. And also, in terms of language, from the war on crime to the war on terror, a lot of the language has stayed the same as well in terms of the history of the FBI's investigations, like this one. I've thought a lot about and a lot of my work, and specifically the making of the film, was this idea, or rooted in this idea, that while we might not ever, speaking from a position of someone who is surveilled and someone rooted in a community that is surveilled, like that, maybe we might not be able to ever stop surveillance. Maybe we'll always be targets of surveillance, but there's a way to disrupt surveillance, which is a one-way gaze by watching back, by looking back. And it's a really old idea about of surveillance, of citizen undersight. And, as long as the history of these FBI investigations into communities of color have existed, there's also this other, quieter history underneath it of people resisting that kind of surveillance, using the ideas of citizen undersight. And that's been something that's really inspired me and my work as well. Just give an example of like Cop Watch as an example. Another example is the brilliant project at the Brooklyn Museum in New York of the Brooklyn, or Muslims in Brooklyn project, but this idea also that, these histories that are only archived within the FBI documents, within this very particular scope, can be unearthed and illustrated in community archives. And that's also a disruption of the secret archive. So yeah, I will stop there before I take up any more time.
Thank you so much, Assia. I'd like to invite Omar.
Hi, everyone. Omar Farah. I couldn't really be happier to be here in conversation with this group that does such incredible thinking on an area of work that's close to me personally, close to CCR institutionally, and that I think requires this sort of constant dialogue to be sure that our resistance and our opposition to the surveillance state is as sophisticated and anchored in social movements and community as it should be. And of course, deep thanks to Highline and STOP and other organizations behind this. The Center for Constitutional Rights was born out of the movement for racial justice in the South. And it's also true, though, that after 9/11, a lot of our institutional resources and litigation and advocacy capacity was sort of focused on the human rights crisis that followed that really tragic day. And the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I think that's where I might start with some of my reflections around surveillance, with really just what to me feels like the point of departure for all of this. And I acknowledge the really brilliant framing that Simone gave us to start with. But the 9/11 moment, I think, was really seminal in shifting the policing paradigm from one that investigates and punishes unlawful conduct after it happened. And I say that with the proviso of all of the ways that our criminal justice system is punitive and racist and oppressive. But a shift from that model to one of predictive policing that tries to anticipate on the basis of what I think really are just crude stereotypes about identity as a mode for identifying and preventing so-called unlawful activity before it ever happens. And I'm really thinking a lot about, because it shapes so much of the work that we do at the Center for Constitutional Rights, the particular frameworks and sort of policy analytics that drive the way surveillance operates, either in-person human surveillance that Assia was describing, that I think, of course, was prevalent and before 9/11 and immediately in the aftermath, but also the digital surveillance that's so prominent now. The Center for Constitutional Rights, along with Muslim advocates, NYCLU, the Clear Project at CUNY, and first and foremost, a remarkable coalition of Black and Brown Muslim communities across the tri-state, litigated and advocated in response to massive NYPD surveillance following the 9/11 attacks. But really what drove that reaction from the NYPD was a framework really that was set out in explicit detail in a report called Radicalization in the West, which through all manner of pseudo-social science tried to create a roadmap, a framework to understand patterns of Muslim behavior that if you followed and understood closely enough would allow you to determine which among the American Muslim population would be law-abiding, quote unquote, normal Muslim citizens, and those who would ultimately become terrorists and who had this latent proclivity towards violence that had to be policed in advance. And the markers of that threat are really everything that anyone would sort of hold on to and associate as part of an evolving identity that all of us, I think, in our own way, sort of identify as the transformation and change that we go through in our life, becoming more religious, becoming less religious, in ways that are markers of Muslim religious identity, growing a beard or shaving a beard, spending more time in a identifiable Muslim community or spending less time. All of these are sort of triggers that bring you within the sweep of the way the surveillance state, in this particular mode that I'm talking about, the NYPD, identified potential risks. And the result of that sort of sweeping indictment of a community on the basis of crude stereotypes and a sense of a proclivity towards violence was an attempt to try to surveil and understand and really map down to the finest detail every aspect of Muslim American life in the tri-state area. The NYPD tried to have someone in every mosque within a 250-mile radius of the city, deployed individuals who were sort of understood as mosque rakers who would enter into local mosques. I'm joining you from Newark. A lot of the NYPD's activity was right here in this city, entering mosques, presenting as sort of ethnically similar to the dominant congregants of that particular mosque, striking up pretextual conversations to try to suss out people's political views to justify a predetermined decision to scrutinize and monitor those communities. And I think part of what is on my mind right now is, as we've hit the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and as we're grappling with the questions that I think both Simone and Assia raised about how we start to organize and think in a more sophisticated way across our identities about the way historically disfavored targeted communities are treated similarly by the surveillance state. I think it's really important to recognize that so much of the post 9/11 surveillance, particularly in this area, was targeted towards Black American Muslims in Brooklyn and in Newark and across the country. And I think that's important for a lot of reasons. One, of course, is that there's been a really unfortunate bifurcation, I think, of what followed 9/11 as falling into this sort of national security counterterrorism bucket, which again, I think is a device, and then what falls into traditional policing work and thinking. And again, part of why I call that a device and why I think that's important to sort of deconstruct is that thinking about counterterrorism and framing it that way is meant, I think, to invoke the fear and sense of destabilization that comes from times of crises and put the very communities that ought to be resisting in the shoes of power and sort of dampening their reflex to speak out and to insist for their rights and accountability. And maybe an example of that is the work that Senator Constitutional Rights did in partnership with Color of Change to, in much the same way that Assia described, although with a lot less creativity and a lot less brilliance, to try to force DHS and the FBI to reveal some of the ways that local law enforcement and national law enforcement were collaborating to surveil the movement for Black lives in the immediate aftermath of the killing of Mike Brown and Eric Garner and so many others. And part of what came out of that, in addition to some of the really absurd and horrifying documents that came out of that, is another example of what to me feels like this sort of overarching framework that drives the way surveillance actually plays out in people's lives, either their digital lives or their lives out in the street. One of the areas that our lawsuit targeted was the subdivision in the Department of Homeland Security called the Intelligence and Analysis Unit. And part of their statutory mandate is to sort of develop these kinds of national security intelligence analyses and then farm them out to the rest of the intelligence apparatus of the government. And one of the documents that we stumbled on in that process was one that internally members of DHS were emailing and referring to as "quote unquote" the race paper. And I would suspect, like us at CCR, many people in this this Zoom meeting would assume that a document titled "the race paper" being batted around within DHS just can't be good. And so we sued to try to get access to that document because it was 7 or 8 pages of analysis, but completely blacked out down to every last letter. We weren't able to get it other than a companion declaration that described it as an analysis of the growing threat of domestic race-based terror. I obviously I can't say more about what was behind the document because we weren't able to see it, but I just point to that as an example of the way that state power and the surveillance state continues to work to develop more sort of frameworks and overarching frameworks to categorize particularly Black and Brown and Muslim and historically disabled communities in ways that make what follows next, all of the modes of surveillance, whether it's digital or in person, that much easier. It sort of greases the wheels in a way that maybe wasn't so necessary in earlier parts of our violent history with race, where racial categorization was enough. I think another sort of part of what that experience sort of revealed for us was the notion that, and I'm thinking now of the Black identity extremism designation. Part of what came out in our records was a similar locution, Black supremacist extremist. But thinking about the first sort of prosecution of someone where that terminology was in play, the weapons charges brought against Rakim Boligan, I think part of what the resistance to surveillance has to contemplate is that once the surveillance state turns on you in a way that is authorized and justified by an analysis that makes you either a current threat or soon to be a threat by virtue of your identity, it can be almost impossible to stay out of the target of power. It's for most of us, if we're watched 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in our lives, we will run afoul of the law. Something in our political views, in our conduct, in our associations will put us on the wrong side or the disfavored side of state power. And that is, I think, part of what is hampered some resistance to the surveillance state, because we have an unfortunate reflex to say, well, I'm not someone who should be surveilled, and others are, and stay quiet as a result. And I think that's part of the work that we have to get engaged in, to deconstruct. And I'm looking forward to talking to Simone and Assia for their brilliant ideas about how we can partner together to do that. Thanks, Lily. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to invite Simone and Assia to come together and we can talk together as a panel. For the first question, all of you touched on this in your talk, but I wanted to dive a little deeper. What does history teach us about what counts as criminal or dangerous? Omar just spoke a lot about this, but Assia, did you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I actually want to draw on some of what Mohammed was talking about, but so to speak about Operation Vulgar Betrayal and the specific investigation that happened in my neighborhood. A lot of the way people felt it in the very beginning was being questioned about their charitable donations. So you would get visits and did you write a check? And we have a copy of a check you wrote, and why do you donate to X, Y, and Z organization, et cetera. So that's sort of how we felt it at the time. Later, before 9/11, a number of Muslim charities, from Bosnian relief organizations to Palestinian aid organizations, were being investigated. For almost a decade before 9/11, a lot of these investigations never resulted in any criminal, charges. Then 9/11 happened, and all of these investigations that were closed were sort of reopened and reinvestigated. A lot of charities went out of business. Muslim charities shut down in this period, just not being able to afford the legal costs. So that was like the experiencing it, and then looking at the documents, narrating basically the story of this investigation from the FBI's documentation of it. They were explicitly looking for white collar crimes. There was this kind of like organized crime approach that the FBI was using in the 90s towards terrorism, this idea of follow the money. There's a great book written about it called, the name escapes me, I'll put it in the chat when I remember, but that the FBI was looking at these Muslim communities and these institutions that were starting among immigrant Muslim communities as like an organized criminal network, fundraising terrorism and funding terrorism. That the explicit, existence of these organizations was actually, a cover for financing terrorism. They lumped in, all of the largest Muslim organizations in the country at the time, and humanitarian relief causes from Africa to Kosovo. So it was a real wide brush. And, one of my upstairs, one of my neighbors, actually my upstairs neighbor in the 90s was the first American citizen ever put, designated on the terrorist watch list. And there was such great fanfare when he was put on the list. And almost more than a decade later, when he was taken off the list, it was a very quiet affair, and nobody really heard about it. And that designation, that kind of red paint that smeared him and his family and the entire community, never was taken off. So it's like these, these criminal, these very large terrorism investigations that sometimes resulted in like small white collar crime charges like mail fraud. This idea too, that when you collect records, for such a long period on anybody, that you can catch folks up on something, that something will come out of that. Someone didn't do their taxes, or someone didn't, and so, that was sort of the experience. And then also, just to address this, something that you said, Ahmad, part of the what that creates is people are afraid to donate, people are afraid to get involved. And this also idea that I heard a lot when I was going to door talking to people that like, if I have nothing to hide, I have nothing to worry about, you know, and the entire premise of that is like that innocence matters, specifically when, and it doesn't. It's like you have a lot to hide if you, I mean, you have a lot to worry about, even if you have nothing to hide, if you are a part of certain communities. And yeah, that was a difficult thing that people, you know, were grasping for in these conversations that I was having.
Basically, to echo what everyone has been saying, and you know, one of the things that history teaches us is that like categories of criminality are, and what is the criminal is manufactured. You could think about the NYPD's now disbanded demographic unit that would infiltrate mosques and other Muslim student groups. Even the documents that, you know, Assia was just talking about from vulgar betrayal, that would be, you know, redacted. Some of them remain classified, but it can still see how, you know, Muslim philanthropic efforts got marketed or manufactured as criminal. And, you know, there was a leak that Omar had mentioned in 2016 of what was the Black Identity Extremists, a leaked document that came out. It was like an FBI threat assessment. And kind of the manufacturing, or kind of shows like the state's ability to manufacture and then also index any type of Black political struggle as, you know, potentially a terrorist threat or an internal threat to the state. And not only in 2016, but you see that with, you know, counterintelligence program of the FBI, you know, from, you know, whatever to the 60s or so. And so it's like a kind of continuing same, but the practices, I think, in many ways have been ratcheted up by ways of technological means, but still, you know, still creating the create and capture, the kind of manufacturing a terrorist thing of having infiltrators. Oh, you want to do this? You want to get a bomb? We'll give you all the supplies and then, or the fake supplies, and then arrest you and charge you. And so I think that is some of the things that we, you know, learn from these histories. And often too, you know, I really like the work, love the work that that Assia is doing around redaction and accessing these documents, and what that can tell us about, you know, the sources and methods, as they say, of the FBI. Even if you get the, you know, we can either confirm or deny, because that would be a confirmation of, you know, the Glomar response. And I think there's maybe some lessons to kind of learn there as well too. And so I'd love to hear about the inverse surveillance project that you are, you know, annotating these documents in different ways and telling different stories of them.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, the project came out of my frustration of like going to war for transparency for these records and winning, and then getting 33,000 pages that were 75% redacted, and like being very, very frustrated as a journalist and thinking of like, okay, what are, first of all, that I think it's after a 7-year-long battle in federal court, it's futile to ask the very same agencies that are heavily invested in these investigations and conducting these operations this way to be transparent about them. A big part of being able to continue it is the secrecy that shrouds how they do what they do. You know, the fact that all the documents you two, you know, you and Ahmed are referring to are entirely, you know, redacted and blacked out. Like that there's an investment in keeping it secret. So, you know, God bless the Freedom of Information Act, but also there's only so far that the FOIA can take you. And so what we're working on, I'm working on this, you know, with collaborators at the MIT Open Documentary Lab, where we're thinking of how can we use artificial intelligence and machine learning specifically to kind of hack into these redactions and understand, like, you can't understand what's in the black hole, but you understand from the context, you know, that it's there and what might be around it. So the way we're doing this is collecting a historical data set from investigations like COINTELPRO and, you know, AIM and the Puerto Rican independence movement, and using that as our data set to try to like historicize these dehistoricized documents, and also add a layer of news in there, like what is the geopolitical timeline that was going on while this was happening. So like layers of an onion that you can peel, maybe not see through, but peel back of the redaction. So this way of trying to understand them. And also, by the way, just to add to this, the way they even, the FBI gives you these documents, like I get them in a CD-ROM, just to talk about like digital, the capacity of digital surveillance and then how the actual transparency happens. They're like basically like JPEGs to actually like take data out of that, and being able to like just copy and paste the text requires so many steps to even do that. And for me, these are all layers of obfuscating, of keeping things secret, of making things difficult, of making it even hard to connect the historical lines, because, all of the historical FOIAs are very hard to find. So I think, yeah, so that's part of the project, is like to connect these things, to use AI to, shed light on some of what's been, purposely obscured for so long.
Thank you. That's really helpful. One thing I just wanted to note is we've been talking about the federal government a lot, but a lot of the practices you're talking about are also things that can happen with local police agencies, and police agencies are connected to federal surveillance through what's called fusion centers. So gang suppression units, and they use gang injunctions to kind of surveil and criminalize, especially like Black youth as part of, as gang members. Those operate on a lot of the same kinds of principles you're talking about making certain categories of activity illegal, making certain kinds of associations criminal. So for those of you who are out there, this is not just a federal government kind of thing. So we've been talking a lot about the state. How should we be thinking about private companies? Simone's presentation is really focused on the history of slavery and the way that laws were upholding the ownership rights of some people over other people. So that's a private right. So today, we see companies selling data, selling surveillance tools, and the kinds of work that you've been tracing. How are private companies or the search for profit shaping this?
It's really a challenge. And it's something we spend a lot of time thinking about, sort of what the right entry point is. And I'm speaking from a litigation and advocacy standpoint, not from just from an analytical standpoint. Assia said this so well. You're sort of making the comment about the distance now between, the gaze and the target. And I think it's not just distance. Obviously, it's sort of, the ease and the comprehensiveness of it. And so think about, I caught an article about, what's happening in Mississippi with the sort of collaboration between in Jackson, Mississippi, with local law enforcement and the sort of Ring app-based doorbell thing that you can have, and the default thinking about being able to just sort of connect your phone and your app and sort of trust that is for that data is something that you can control in some way, I think is a fiction. The challenge, though, is where does the harm sort of originate? Is it in the development of these tools that make it nearly impossible to push back, or is it in their use, which I think the sort of common refrain that you get from law enforcement is that it's about understanding, which isn't really unlike what we came up against in all of our post 9/11 NYPD surveillance, which is that we're not really doing anything. We're just trying to understand the threat matrix, because by the time that information gets operationalized and shows up in someone's life, it can be really hard to resist at that point. So I think that is sort of a central question, and I wonder if Assia or Simone have reflections on ways to sort of crack that. I think the other part of this that's lurking is just the way that state power gets deputized to private actors, corporate and even individual actors at this point, where the framing of someone as a threat is so, or a community as a threat is so commonly understood and so commonly held that state and private actors are sort of authorized to make determinations and act on it. And that also is, I think, again, as we get further away from 9/11, that is another frontier that we've got to, for communities resisting, we have to sort of confront.
And I think in many ways, it's with these private actors, private companies, and we know who they are. Really, you think about Amazon and whatnot. But there has to be moments of like, refusal, at least a moratorium, refusal for things like citizen apps, neighborhood watch, and all of those types of Ring accessories that could now fly around your home like drones, internal ones, because of it's kind of like a fear-based, anxiety-based ways in which many folks approach surveillance and its uses of these direct-to-consumer technologies in their homes and outside of it. It is still about as Omar was just discussing about, again, criminalizing certain moves in certain neighborhoods, certain spaces, certain actors, and also the ways people move within and without space. So it's still about kind of like the regulation of space and mobility. And I think as well as refusal, some of these companies still, and they do need to pay reparations for the harms that is caused by, people's data, information turned into private property, intellectual property, and then monetized. And that could be one way, policy regulation. I guess all of these moments of protest and challenging, and also, really kind of thinking about community around questions of care, around questions of abolition, as opposed to fortress-like securitizations of our homes and our neighborhoods and our schools, and the making of public-private spaces.
Yeah, yes to all of that. I just wanted to give two examples. In Detroit, there's something called the Green Light Project that kind of incentivizes businesses in Detroit to have cameras set up, surveillance cameras that are live, direct streaming to police departments, and gives them a subsidy to put up the cameras. This is a private company that they use for that, and there are folks in like the BYP 100 in Detroit that have been organizing specifically against this, and a lot of that has to do with convincing small business owners that this is not safety. This is about other alternative ideas of safety, of also, speaking to Black and Brown folks that own these places that are, being incentivized to use these devices. In Chicago, there's a whole coalition and movement against the ShotSpotter program. This private company with that claims to be able to hear, that does audio surveillance for gunshots, and that is actually only right 18% of the time, but claims something like a 90%. Also, its data is manipulatable at the back end, and they often go in to correct the data to match up, how it's being written up. So there's an entire movement here to get, first of all, to even find that line item in the police budget, in the CPD budget, and then talk about the technology itself, its efficacy, and why the contract basically should not be renewed. And there's a movement happening that's organizing around that in Chicago. So there are a lot of local efforts like trying to identify the connection between how local law enforcement is using this private tech and justifying its use using, it's an algorithm, it's perfect, of course, right? As the justification for this, and people locally organizing against that in really smart ways.
Can I add just quickly to this? And I'm so grateful to Simone for bringing up the notion of reparations in this space, because part of what's also missing in the discourse around the digital surveillance is the harm that it causes. I think even in sort of on the street surveillance, it's been hard for us, for example, to get a court to understand the impact of a conversation that happens, and that for pretextual reasons, if there isn't some adverse law enforcement decision that follows immediately after. What ultimately is the cost of surveillance if you don't know that you're being watched? And I think it's harder to push back on that idea with digital surveillance, which is so ubiquitous but seems not intrusive. I think we have work to do to start to talk about what are the real-time harms for someone who thinks that posting a photo of them and someone who lives in their neighborhood or in their apartment block will land them on a gang database, or someone who knows that their neighborhood is watched because all the doorknobs have the Ring app that we're talking about, and it's linked to local surveillance, in a way that changes behavior, perceptions of oneself, and the way it pulls at the fabric of community. I think those are real costs that are borne by Black and Brown communities all across the country, and others as well. But I think that's something that we've got to start to talk about in a more sort of direct way.
I teach Assia's film in my screen in my class, and we have a really good discussion about the it's terrifying, the psychic effects of surveillance. And there's what it means to kind of internalize that trauma. There's one moment where you talk about the speed bump that's put outside your home. And it's like a tailgating practice, like the idea of like the click when your phones are being tapped so that you know that it's happening. And it just kind of, I don't know where I was gonna, go with that moment, but just to say that I think that what Omar just brought up, like, how do you make that tangible unless there is, an arrest records, a FOIA document, or, whatever it is. And I think it's so important to take these moments of whether it is, people's testimony of life under surveillance, and see that as, I don't want to use the word data, but that's all that's coming to my mind, but it tells us something about how we're living under surveillance, but also the capacity to challenge and resist it. And I think that that's what, that film does, and also, many other texts, Assata's biographies, these things.
Yeah, I think that another layer to all of that is like a lot of the effects and the ramifications are psychological. There are mental health, and these are already stigmatized, and shame, like there's a lot of shame around them already, specifically in our communities. So like all of these things are wrapped up with also why folks don't talk about it out loud, or why it's hard to quantify what the effect is. Even when I was making the film, people kept asking, well, what is tell me you have cancer. Tell me what was the word? Show me your wound. Like, it was like, how do you show psychological, ramifications? And that's really hard. And it's, and I think that's also why it's hard for folks to talk about. And then to layer on top of it, like so many of these things, like to talk about the investigations, like I always think like you can trace a line between the effect in the community and the tactic that was used, like the use of informants, the pervasive use of informants, fragmented entirely, like tight-knit communities, and the trust in communities. You can draw a straight line, between those two things, between also, the alienation and distrust that starts building up, in a collective, in a group. And then also the layer, the layer from the documents is that these are psychological operations. These are psych ops that the FBI has explicitly been cultivating these tactics since COINTELPRO. Like, the COINTELPRO records are unredacted, and you can see very explicitly, like, the idea is to, make the Black Panthers seem crazy so that they're discredited in the media and in the general public. And that's explicit in the documents, to build that up. So it's like, there is this really funky thing that's happening between like the fact that these are psychological operations, and that some of the effects of these tactics are causing like mental health problems in the community, and the fact that people don't want to talk about that in the community or even recognize, because this is something that hasn't stopped happening. So it's difficult to talk about something while it's happening. But yeah, I think like those are some of the layers of the effect.
CCR is working on this challenge now, trying to do the sort of labor-intensive work of documenting what the impact is by meeting with folks and having conversations that don't presume to know what the harms of surveillance are, but really invite deep reflection and trying to think about, which I think is something that's, that all of us are touching on here, the ways that it's consistent across communities and the way that it's different across lived identities, and the harm specifically, and then to have sort of an intergenerational component as well, so that it's, the ways that resistance has been successful in the past, it is also informing what social movements are doing now in terms of building their strategies and work. So I just think this is like an indispensable part of the resistance, because, and I say this as someone who works in this area and has sort of met these challenges. Our legal system is I don't think it's by chance, our legal system is just not well equipped to comprehend or really address the kinds of harms that we know from our various experiences and from our clients and communities that we represent, that folks are enduring. It's very hard to translate the lived experience of feeling destabilized and unwelcome in your own communities and homes, and afraid to go to places that you associate with your identity, as a cognizable judicial harm. And we can do it, but it's a challenge. So
this conversation is making me think about the ways that you talk about surveillance kind of dividing communities as trust frays, as informants are planted. To what extent, I want to just maybe expand that into this broader theme of conscription, like how I think you spoke about this when you were giving your presentations, some of the ways, I think, Assia, you talked about this, that we are conscripted into acts of surveillance. And then what happens when within communities that are being surveilled, or your neighbors or siblings or cousins are being surveilled? Are there, how do you deal with the complexities of some people being invested in the kind of mode of knowing and punishment that surveillance usually goes along with? And then how do you work through that? Assia, your film so beautifully depicts going like door to door and having these conversations with people. And so I thought maybe you might have stories from your community, or Omar from the organizing work that CCR is affiliated with. I guess where the question comes from for me is as an Iranian American, it's like we're Middle Eastern, but we're a group that, in immigrating to the United States, a lot of times people aspire to associate themselves with whiteness, have the house in the suburbs, have the, quote unquote good school for the kids, and like the kind of imaginaries of public safety that a white supremacist America kind of tells you. And so how do people break down the kinds of privilege that people might seek through the kind of safety that surveillance promises? Maybe another way of putting the question. And I think related to this is Suad asks a lot of really good questions in the Q&A, but they note that the FBI and DHS has been leveraging public sentiment against white nationalism as a tool to expand surveillance and prosecution. So that's another act of conscripting, through people's desire for some kind of social order, but doing it through surveillance. So just interested in anything that anything that makes you think about.
One set of documents that came to light in the work that we did against the FBI and DHS sort of comes to mind, and this was I think this was DHS. It was a series of exchanges about, in anticipation of the Ferguson uprising, sharing really just like tabloid drivel, but internally within the agency about ISIS fighters recruiting the Ferguson protesters. And, I can't establish a one-to-one correlation, but you think about the intense militarized response to Black political speech. It's not, it doesn't take too many steps to sort of see the framing that's applied to it. And part of what I think is, there's some opportunity lurking in those documents, as absurd and sort of scary as they are, which is to sort of lay bare the way that the surveillance state sees these particular communities and identities as not particularly distinct, with respect to the way it applies power. And so I think there's, that's part of what I feel like the work is to show that there really is no, I think this is also what Simone was saying earlier, there is no safe space from the surveillance state, and there is no way to be good enough to exempt yourself if you belong to one of these historically disfavored groups. And some of what has been really brilliant, I think, in the resistance to surveillance post 9/11 has been that black voices have been really central in creating and bringing to life the history that Simone laid out so ably in her presentation. And some of our clients are in the Hassan case, just for one example, are folks who were surveilled, for their participation and their membership in the Nation of Islam, surveilled and monitored under the NYPD sort of like stop and frisk by virtue of their blackness and their neighborhood, and then surveilled again post 9/11 as part of the demographics unit's work, and so just within the span of one not too particularly old person's lifetimes, 3 cycles of really elaborate, intense surveillance for the particular ways that their identity intersect. Those voices, I think, have been kind of instrumental in pushing back on what you described, Lily, just the sort of aspiration to be, to go along, to get along.
I think for me, one of the things I try not to do is to like position myself as an innocent actor when it comes to surveillance, and think about the ways that I might or perhaps enact it, whether that be, as an instructor, especially an instructor now in this, COVID era, through Zoom, through, Proctorio, Print Panoptico, and all of these things that we could find other ways to assess learning with our students, even things like not having the camera on or not, and where's that data going and, uploaded and all of those things. So those are some ways in which I think there's, there's an article recently that Chris Gillard and David Galumba co-wrote on luxury surveillance, and to think about like the idea that, I might have this watch that might tell me when to stand up or might check my steps. And the B side of that is those that, have no right of refusal. Like, what are the carceral logics around electronic monitoring that people might call ankle bracelets, and other ways in which, certain communities, criminalized communities, post-incarceration, people who have, might be subjected to that kind of technology, and in of course it's in harmful ways. Electronic monitor would damage the skin. It might make it quite difficult to to pick up your kid at the bus stop because you'll be out of range. And in many ways, that is a way of kind of like extending the prison into people's homes, spaces of work, and other parts of social life. And so I guess there's a lot of ways to kind of think about those objects, whether that be a drone or an ankle bracelet, but how do we think about how we are, in some ways, part of the practice of how these things get authorized by the ways that we use different technologies that might be supported and created by the same companies or the same technology or the same, cloud storage.
Yeah, and as a professor who teaches, I'm so glad you brought up the way the surveillance becomes part of our everyday practices, because just the way that some of these software platforms encourage the kind of view from a distance that you all are talking about, and the kind of contextless, like worst case imagination about what the students' intentions are if they're not, say, participating. I think it kind of goes to show how the logics that you've been tracing actually suffuse many parts of culture that are not directly tied to law enforcement institutionally. So you've already talked a bit about this, but I wanted to just hear your thoughts, keeping the audience in mind as people who are situated in all kinds of different places, different kinds of work, surveillance affects them differently. Can you talk about ways that people survive and resist surveillance? Swad had said in the Q&A, how do you handle the balance in alerting people, but not perpetuating fear? And in one of my favorite movies, Sorry to Bother You, one of the characters says, if you tell people what's wrong, we don't tell them what to do about it. They just kind of get used to it and normalize it. So in the spirit of that, like, how can we be expansive and seeing modes of survival and resistance?
I'll jump in just to say that it's also the case that knowing like the scope and insidious reach of like state surveillance, which, with all of the leaks and information that's come out just in the last 5 years, hasn't necessarily like changed people's behavior either. So it's not, like, I think I always refer to this great saying by the organizers that are part of Stop LAPD Spying. They say, build power, not paranoia. Like the idea is like knowing more, knowing hasn't necessarily, like changed people's behavior, but it's about what we know and understanding that like alongside this long history of, the surveillance apparatus, there's a long history of resisting it, of staying sane, of building techniques of counter surveillance and providing alternative safety in communities. And there's a lot to learn from those different communities. So building power is about like talking out loud about a thing that we've only whispered about talking to each other about it. I also think like, of the panopticon and the metaphor of the panopticon, and like what would the inverse of a panopticon look like? And the inverse of a panopticon would be like people are able to look at each other and able to look, back at the surveillance apparatus. It's not just looking back; it's about like looking around too. And so I think like there's a lot of shame wrapped up in this, and talking out loud about things busts shame too. So like talking out loud within communities that have been surveilled, even if it's not around like, a civil rights or legal framework, even if it's just around like, collective trauma and telling those stories and sharing our fears out loud, that is a lot of the resistance happens there. It's not necessarily like there are many paths, but that's one of them, this whole idea of like looking around.
I hadn't thought about surveillance in the context of restorative justice. I had a conversation with Tarek Ismail at the CUNY Clear Project, and it part of, I think, to answer your question, Lily, part of what it can happen and should be happening, and I credit Clear for working on this, is trying to also make sure that we don't throw away folks in our community who have been caught up, by the surveillance state and who have been enlisted to do the work of power in neighborhoods, as destructive as that can be. And I think, that's, I think, sort of a baseline part of effective organizing, is to keep your people together and to work through harm that's been done without disposing and sort of entrenching the hard, brittle dynamics that can happen in a targeted community that Assia's film and her work talk about so much. So I think that's also, it's the work of organizers. It's not not lawyers, but I think that's sort of a big part of what's happening. So much of what followed 9/11 was the fragmentation of communities and people hiding from each other.
There's a part in the feeling of being watched, Assia, where you filmed, going to a community meeting with elders and people at the mosque, and there's one guy that says, when you got a problem, the FBI is there to save you, or something like that. And so I think, to echo Omar as well too, is to look at abolitionist practices of where do we go for help, safety, and care, and not look necessarily to these to police, the state, and other kind of alphabet agencies there. And I think the question that was asked at the beginning is that what do we do so that we don't create more fear or anxiety? And I think people need to be more afraid. But to recognize that the ways that the business end of the surveillance state is really unevenly applied. And so what do we do around protecting communities, immigrant communities, communities of undocumented folks, communities of trans folks? What do we do around safety and security and protection, for those that are increasingly harmed like by the surveillance state? So I think it is about, not necessarily, I don't know, paranoia works for me too, because we know the records are there of the kind of the tactics and the methods and the sources that are and will seemingly continue to be used.
Thank you so much to all of you for these insights, and to the folks in the Q&A who are also kind of pushing our conversation in new directions. I'm going to hand it over to Melanie to wrap us up.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so beyond grateful for this conversation that's situated such a broad scope, both of technical and historical and contemporary insights, as well as discussions about lived experience of surveillance in a way that seems so graceful and effortless when it comes from all of y'all. And I know that, everyone is grappling with all the time. I also just want to share that I was hearing from folks who are watching via text message in other parts of New York City, stories from coworkers who were sitting and saying, that happened to me, that happened to my family, that happened to my mom. And so those connections, I am so appreciative of everyone being in this space and being able to expand these conversations. Thank you also, I want to share, in addition to our amazing panelists, our moderator, to all of my colleagues who've been making these events possible, especially Constanza Valenzuela, working behind the scenes to keep us all running smoothly, as well as the advisors who've been guiding all of our public engagement around this project, the Center for Constitutional Rights, Immigrant Defense Project, Media Justice, Mi Gente, Empower Change, and Reprieve. A shout out also to the Plinth Committee, our contemporary art leaders committing to realizing major commissions and engaging in the public success of the Plinth, who make these conversations possible. And of course, to our audience and everyone who has attended here. A quick call out to dive in for our last conversation in this series, the sixth and final. Please join us upcoming in 2 weeks on October 27th at 6 p.m. Eastern for Public Health, Privacy, and Surveillance, which will feature epidemiologist Renee Najera, Electronic Freedom Foundation member Adam Schwartz, and will be moderated by Cheryl Faith Stolberg from the New York Times. We'll be looking at the tensions between public health, privacy, COVID, and surveillance, both from technical and historical standpoints. So you'll be able to sign up for all of those in the chat, as well as to sign up for our newsletter to learn about all of the public events and upcoming programs that we have. So thank you again to everyone who is in these boxes and virtual rooms with us. I can't wait until we all get to be in person to appreciate one another, and join us again soon, and have a great evening.